It was not a long sound, perhaps a minute, perhaps less, but it went on long enough that there could be no mistaking what it was or what it meant. Then silence. It is July of 1918, and the city has grown quieter than it should be. I walk the same streets each morning past the same houses, carrying my basket as if nothing has changed. But there is a house on the hill now, surrounded by a wooden fence where people no longer look for long. I do not stop when I pass it, I do not speak of it, but I know who is inside, and I remember what they were before the world closed in around them. My name is Yelena Fyodorovna, and I have carried secrets in my heart for longer than I care to remember. Tonight, as the hour grows late and the candle burns low on my windowsill, I find myself turning toward memory the way an old woman turns toward warmth, not because it comforts precisely, but because it is all that remains. The walls of this small room hold nothing of consequence. A coat on a nail, a tin cup, a wooden icon that once hung in a better place. But inside me, there is a whole world preserved, intact and precise, like flowers pressed between the pages of a book no one else will ever read. Outside my window, Ekaterinburg breathes in the darkness. It is a city that has seen too much now and learned to say very little. I have learned the same lesson. We are well suited, this city and I. I was not always a washerwoman, you understand. These hands that now scrub stains from strangers' linens, that smell of lye from morning until night, that crack and bleed in winter, these same hands once fastened pearl buttons on the Tsarina's morning gown. 47 buttons, from the base of the spine to the nape of the neck. I counted them every morning for years. I could do it in the dark, by touch alone, which sometimes I did when she was speaking to someone and I did not wish to interrupt. These eyes, now blurred by candlelight and decades of steam, once watched the Grand Duchesses recite French conjugations in rooms glittering with chandeliers. I watched them grow from girls into young women. I watched them learn to hold their heads in a certain way, to smile at visiting dignitaries without revealing anything real. I watched them read. I watched them pray. I watched them, sometimes, weep, though they were careful about who saw that. I was careful too. That is how I survived as long as I did in that world. Carefulness is its own kind of currency. But that was before the world turned upside down, before the very bones of holy Russia cracked and gave way beneath us, as if the frozen ground of all our winters had softened at last, and everything we had built upon it simply sank. It was in 1903 that I first entered service at the Winter Palace. I was barely 17, the daughter of a minor court official who had managed to secure me a position through fragile connections and a series of persistent letters written on paper better than he could truly afford. My father had pressed the ink dry and handed them to me with both hands, as if he were delivering something sacred. "Remember who you are," he said, "and remember who they are. Keep the two things separate, and you will be fine." I remembered his words often in the years that followed, though I did not always manage to obey them. The interview itself felt like a kind of trial. I remember standing alone in an antechamber so vast it might have swallowed my entire village. Its ceilings painted with allegorical figures I could not name, its floors so polished I could see my own face looking up at me from below, pale and frightened. My woolen dress felt coarse against the silk-paneled walls. A clock somewhere ticked with extraordinary patience. I counted its beats. When the household marshal finally called my name, my knees nearly gave out. "Yelena Fyodorovna Volkonsky," he announced, though my family name was nothing so grand. It was a kindness, I realized later, a quiet elevation, a minor adjustment in the ledger of identity meant to help me blend into the world of aristocrats I was entering. I was being fitted to the place, the way a seamstress lets out the seams of a dress that must accommodate a different figure than the one it was made for. The Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna received me in her private sitting room, a space layered in velvet and lamplight, warm despite its grandeur, crowded with photographs and small objects that made it feel less like a state apartment and more like a nest. She was younger than I expected, perhaps 28, with auburn hair that caught fire in the afternoon sun and lay across her shoulders in a way that seemed almost too informal for an empress. Her German accent shaped her Russian in a way that made each word sound both foreign and familiar, as if she were translating from one interior language into another. She studied my face with pale blue eyes that seemed to see beyond my uniform, beyond my carefully rehearsed curtsy, down into the actual person beneath. "You come recommended by Baron Fredericks," she said, setting aside the embroidery she had been holding. "He says you are discreet and capable. These are virtues I value highly, more highly, perhaps, than cleverness. Cleverness is common here. Discretion is not." I curtsied as I had been taught, awkwardly still, my form not yet practiced into ease. "Your Imperial Majesty, I am honored to serve." She smiled, and I saw in it the trace of something that would come to define my years at court, an aching, essential loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, she was rarely alone in any physical sense, but the loneliness of being seen and not known, of being surrounded by ceremony and starved of simplicity. It was the loneliness of a woman who had married not just a man, but a myth, and who found herself, daily, expected to inhabit the myth rather than the marriage. "I hope you would find your place here comfortable, Yelena Fyodorovna," she said. "The palace can be overwhelming at first. It was for me. But there are corners of it that are almost ordinary. You will find them." I found them, and in those ordinary corners, I found her. My duties centered on the Tsarina's personal needs. I helped her dress each morning, selecting gowns worth more than my father earned in a year, fastening those 47 buttons while she stood still and gazed at something beyond the mirror. I accompanied her to charitable engagements, quiet visits to hospitals and orphanages that received no fanfare, that few outside the palace ever knew about. She was generous in ways she did not publicize, which I always thought was the truest form of generosity. In the evenings, I read aloud to her when the Tsar was away, which was often. She preferred English novels. She had grown up speaking English as much as German, and she would sit with her embroidery while I read, her needle moving in slow rhythms that seemed to follow the cadence of the prose. Sometimes she would ask me to repeat a passage, not because she had not heard it, but because she liked the sound of it. "Read that again," she would say, and I would, and in the silence that followed, I understood that she was storing something away, against some future need she did not yet know the shape of. But it was the children who truly captured my heart. They always do with those who have none of their own. The Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, were like shafts of light in that heavy, perfumed world, each one distinct, each one irreplaceable. Olga, the eldest, carried a scholar's soul and the sadness that often accompanies too much awareness. She read everything she could find and worried about things she could not change. At 15, she had already developed the habit of sitting very still and watching a room rather than participating in it, not from shyness, but from a kind of careful discernment. She saw what was real. It was both her gift and her burden. Tatiana was composed and commanding, a born organizer who had inherited her mother's capacity for detail and her father's instinct for fairness. She managed the household rhythms the way a conductor manages an orchestra, with quiet authority, intervening before crises rather than after them. The other girls called her the governess, which was partly a tease and partly genuine respect. Maria was the beauty, with her father's ocean-deep eyes and a warmth that softened every room she entered. She was the most natural of them, the most unguarded, the most easily moved to laughter or tears, the most likely to strike up a conversation with a servant or a guard without any sense of condescension. She simply liked people. It was a rare quality in that household. And Anastasia, impish, dramatic, endlessly entertaining, was the spark that could set an entire tea service laughing. She did impressions of visiting ambassadors, whispered audacious commentary during formal dinners, and once persuaded the entire household staff to participate in a theatrical production of her own devising, in which the villain was unmistakably modeled on one of the less popular chamberlains. He did not find it as amusing as everyone else did. She didn't seem to mind. They were, all four of them, genuinely themselves. The palace tried to shape them into something more symbolic, and to some degree it succeeded. They learned the gestures and the protocols, the strategic smiles and the careful silences. But inside all of that, the real girls persisted. I always loved them for that. In 1904, the Tsarevich Alexei was born, and the world inside the palace shifted on its axis. He was beautiful, fair-haired and blue-eyed like his mother, with a gravity in his expression that seemed to belong to someone older, someone who already knew something. The celebrations lasted for days. Bells rang across the city. Candles were lit in every church I could see from the palace windows. But within weeks, we began to understand the nature of his illness. I was present during those tense early months when it became apparent that a bruise would not fade, that a cut would not stop bleeding, that a fall that would have left another child merely crying left this child in agony for days. The word hemophilia was not spoken aloud in my presence. Such things were not discussed with servants, but its shadow moved through every conversation, every whispered conference in doorways. I remember the panic, how the color drained from the Tsarina's face when he bled, how she would sit beside his bed through entire nights with her hands folded in her lap, not sleeping, barely praying, just watching. The hushed voices of Dr. Botkin, and the strange pilgrim Rasputin murmuring behind closed doors. A sense of dread that hung above the palace like smoke from a fire that no one would name. It was this fear for her son, I have always believed, that began to hollow the Tsarina out. Not the revolution that was coming, not the political pressures, not the loneliness of the court. All of those things wore at her steadily, like water on stone. But the fear for Alexei was acute. It was a knife she carried inside her always, and it cut her daily from within. I recall one evening in 1905, after the unrest of Bloody Sunday. The reports had come in. Priests had led a procession to the Winter Palace to deliver a petition, and the guards had opened fire. Hundreds dead, the city reeling. The Tsarina had spent the day receiving deputations and composing herself for official appearances, and by the evening she was wrung out, her eyes red-rimmed in a way she would never have permitted in public. I was brushing her hair, an act that calmed her, that returned her to something bodily and present when her mind threatened to float away into abstraction, and she was gazing not at herself in the mirror, but through it, toward something I could not see. "Yelena Fyodorovna," she asked softly, "do you think the people hate us so?" Court etiquette urged comfort. My training urged reassurance. But something in her voice, raw and genuinely curious and frightened, made honesty the only kindness available to me. "Your Majesty," I said carefully, "I think they are afraid. And when people are afraid and hungry and uncertain of their future, they look for someone to blame. It may not be hatred exactly. It may be something that looks like hatred, but comes from a different place." She was quiet for a moment. The brush moved through her hair. Outside, the city was quiet now, too, the particular quiet that follows violence, which is nothing like ordinary silence. "I try to help," she said at last. "The hospitals, the charities, the letters, it never seems to matter. And Nicky, he carries everything alone. He will not share the weight of it. Sometimes when he reads his reports in the evenings, I watch him and I see the weight of it folding him in half, and I want to take some of it from him, and he will not let me. He smiles at me and says everything is in hand, and I know it is not." "He is protecting you," I said. "Yes," she said, "he is always protecting me. I am not sure it is what I need." In those quiet moments, I saw her not as empress, but as a wife and mother, worried, outmatched, desperately trying to protect a world that was slipping through her fingers like water, like time, like the decades themselves. Her letters to the Tsar, sometimes 2 or 3 a day when he was traveling, were full of devotion and practical advice, a strange mixture of affection and statecraft that I think surprised even her. She had never meant to be political. She had only meant to help. Even the children felt the change in the years that followed. By 1906, their daily walks grew shorter. The laughter in the garden grew quieter, more conscious of itself, more aware of the watching eyes on the other side of the fence. Tatiana once asked me, while sitting at her embroidery frame on a gray November afternoon, "Why do the guards never smile anymore?" I struggled for an answer that was true without being frightening. "The world has grown more complicated," I said finally. "Everyone feels the weight of it. But your parents love you, and they want to keep you safe, and that has not changed." "Safe from what?" she asked, unblinking. It was not a child's question. She was 11 years old, and she already knew it was not a child's question. Before I could reply, the Tsarina entered the room. She must have overheard, for she went straight to Tatiana without acknowledgement of me, and smoothed her daughter's hair back from her forehead with both hands, the way you do when you are trying to reach someone through the simple fact of touch. "Safe from worry, darling," she said, but her voice wavered slightly at the end, like a veil lifted by a breath of wind, and Tatiana heard it, and I heard it, and nothing more was said about it. The years that followed felt like a slow slide into shadow. Each crisis built another wall between the family and the country they ruled. The war with Japan, the revolution of 1905, the fragile Duma and its slow suffocation, the constant whisper of conspiracy and discontent. And always, hovering at the edge of everything, Rasputin. His presence was like a shadow that slipped beneath palace doors, never quite visible, never quite absent, impossible to dismiss because the Tsarina's desperate belief in his ability to help Alexei made dismissal feel like cruelty. Still, I stayed. I watched and I worried and I stayed. By 1913, at the tercentenary of Romanov rule, the family celebrated with imperial pageantry, processions, services, receptions, 300 years of history compressed into ceremonial gesture. But I remember the Tsar's weary eyes above his fixed smile, the Tsarina's careful posture that never quite relaxed, the children performing their roles with the practiced grace of people who have been taught that performance is a form of duty. It was a beautiful ceremony. It was also, though none of us would have said it, a kind of farewell. Then came the Great War. The Tsar left for the front in 1914, then again in 1915 to take personal command of the armies. The Tsarina transformed herself into a nurse, not the honorary kind, not the kind that arrives in pressed white for a photograph and leaves before the smell reaches them, but the actual kind, the kind that changes dressings and holds hands and sits with the dying. Olga and Tatiana followed her example. I stood beside her in hospital wards as she moved from bed to bed, listening to men describe what they had seen, writing letters for those who could no longer hold a pen, pressing the hands of those who needed nothing more than the knowledge that someone was present with them in their suffering. In those rooms of suffering, she was most herself. The formality fell away. The empress disappeared. What remained was simply a woman with steady hands and a willingness to be present with pain. Qualities more useful in those wards than any crown. But outside the hospitals, the empire was groaning. News from the front grew darker with every dispatch. Food became scarce. Coal became scarce. Patience became scarce. The Tsarina's letters to the Tsar became more urgent, her advice more pointed, her frustration with the ministers who surrounded her more visible, and her critics, who had never been quiet, now grew louder. The German woman, they called her, the spy, the witch. As if the losses at the front, the shortages in the cities, the confusion at the top of every ministry were all her doing. Her personal betrayal of a country she had come to love more than the one she was born in. The winter of 1916 into 1917 was the cruelest I remember. Rooms in the palace went unheated. Meals grew sparse. The corridors that had once hummed with the business of empire fell quiet. The Tsarina would sit by whatever fire could be managed, embroidery in hand, and stare through the flames at something I could never see. "Yelena Fyodorovna," she said to me one such night, her voice very low, "do you ever feel as if we are the last people in the world?" I did not offer comfort. I had learned over the years that she did not want comfort as much as she wanted honesty. "Yes," I said, "sometimes I do." She nodded. That was all. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the city like a living thing. Then came Rasputin's murder, in December 1916, by men who should have been loyal, men from within their own circle. Her grief was sharp and absolute, not only for him, but for what his death represented. The final proof that the world she had believed in, sacred, ordered, protected by divine will, had already been dismantled without her knowledge. If those closest to the throne would turn on a man she trusted, what would others do? "If they kill a man of God," she said to me very quietly the night the news reached us, "what will they do to us?" I had no answer. I only sat with her in the dark, listening to the silence that comes before the end. The silence that is not peaceful, but merely the absence of whatever comes next. And through it all, the children kept singing. On evenings when the world felt most closed in and the anxiety most acute, they would gather around the piano in the smaller sitting room, Olga playing, the others clustered around her, and sing the old songs together, their voices soft and harmonized, blending into something that sounded like both prayer and farewell. I would stand in the hallway and listen, not wanting to intrude. I still hear them sometimes, in my better dreams. They are always smiling, always gathered together, always before the music stops. The revolution came not with a single gunshot, but like a fever, spreading slowly, quietly, and then all at once, the way all fevers do when they have been ignored long enough. On the morning of March 8th, 1917, I was in the Tsarina's chambers, lacing her bodice and smoothing her sleeves, preparing her for what we assumed would be an ordinary day. The morning light came through the windows at its usual angle. The fire had been laid and lit. The household moved through its familiar motions. The wireless, the new one installed the previous year, crackled with reports of unrest in Petrograd, but we had heard such whispers for so long that they had lost most of their sting. Unrest was almost ordinary by then. It was the quiet that was unusual. It was her maid, Demidova, who broke the illusion. She entered breathless, her face flushed from running, her composure, usually so reliable, she had served the household for nearly as long as I had, entirely undone.
"Your Majesty," she gasped, "the telephone lines to Petrograd have been cut, all of them. And there are reports, soldiers in the streets, but not to control the crowds. They are joining them."
The Tsarina froze before her mirror. I watched her reflection very carefully. Her hands paused at her collarbone where I had been fastening a brooch. I saw her process the information, saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible compression of her lips. She had been expecting something like this, I think. Perhaps not today, perhaps not in precisely this form, but she had been expecting something like this for years, and so the first response was not surprise, but a kind of terrible recognition. "And the Tsar?" she asked. Her voice was very steady. "Still at military headquarters in Mogilev, Your Majesty. No direct word has come through since last evening." She was quiet for 3 long seconds. Then, "Thank you, Demidova. Please ask Tatiana to come to me. Quietly, if you can manage it." Demidova withdrew. The Tsarina turned back to her mirror and regarded herself for a moment with the expression of someone preparing to enter a difficult room. "Finish the brooch, please, Yelena Fyodorovna," she said. "We will not give the children reason to worry until we have more information." The rest of that day felt suspended in a strange performance, all of us playing our parts in a production whose script was being rewritten in real time, none of us quite sure which scene we were in. The children attended their lessons, though their tutors' eyes kept drifting to the windows. The Tsarevich was kept close to the palace, his usual outdoor excursions quietly cancelled. The Tsarina sat with her embroidery in the afternoon sitting room, receiving reports at intervals from the handful of officials who still had access, her needle moving through its work with a steadiness that I recognized as consciously maintained. I noticed she repeated the same stitch again and again, a small loop in the corner of the pattern, unpicked and re-sewn, unpicked and re-sewn, her hands needing something to do while her mind was elsewhere. By the evening, rumors thickened in the corridors. The Duma had refused the Tsar's order to dissolve. Several regiments of the Imperial Guard had defected to the crowds. The phrase "provisional government" was being used in official dispatches, which meant it had already moved from rumor to reality before any of us had been properly informed. The palace was full of whispers, servants leaning into each other in doorways, guards who had begun to look at each other in the particular way people look when they are calculating which side of something they ought to be on. I had seen that look before. I had learned to recognize it. That night, the Tsarina summoned me to her private study. She had dismissed the others. Only a single lamp lit the room, throwing long shadows across the pale blue wallpaper she had chosen herself years before, a pattern of small flowers that had always seemed to me more suited to a dacha than to an imperial palace, which was, I think, precisely why she had chosen it. Her voice was steady, but her eyes moved in a way I had not seen before, alert, calculating, assessing the room as if measuring distances. "Yelena Fyodorovna, I want you to prepare a small bag for me. Nothing elaborate, essentials only. Medicines, particularly for Alexei. Some personal documents, a few items of jewelry, not the ceremonial pieces, but smaller things, things that could be worn or carried without drawing attention." She paused. "We may need to leave quickly. Shall I prepare the same for the children?" She hesitated, a long hesitation, the kind that contains a decision being made in real time. Then she nodded. "Yes, but quietly. I don't want to frighten them. They have enough to carry already." That night, as I moved through the palace in the hours before dawn, gathering what was necessary into plain bags that I hid in the linen closet nearest the family's apartments, I passed through a palace that no longer quite knew what it was. Servants whispered behind half-closed doors. Guards stood at their posts with an unfamiliar uncertainty in their posture. Still present, still armed, but somehow already elsewhere in their minds. The corridors that had once carried the purposeful traffic of empire were unnaturally quiet, lit at long intervals, full of the particular stillness of things that know they are ending. I did not sleep that night. I don't believe many people in that building did. By morning, it was over. The Tsar had abdicated, not from the throne room, not in any ceremony I had imagined, but from a railway car at a station in Pskov, in a telegram that was handed around and read and reread as if repetition might change its meaning. He had abdicated not just for himself, but for his son, Alexei's hemophilia making the succession impossible, or so the official reasoning went. 300 years of Romanov rule ended in a railway station, in a few lines of text, delivered by an official who had to be sent for specially because the Tsar had not expected to need one. I was present when the Tsarina received the news. She stood in the center of her sitting room. She had arranged the children around her beforehand, as if she had known something was coming, though she could not have known the form it would take. Holding the paper with both hands, reading it once, then again, with the careful attention of someone making absolutely certain they have understood correctly. The children watched her with the particular intensity of children watching a parent for signals, trying to read from her expression what they themselves were supposed to feel. "Papa is coming home," she said at last. Her voice did not break. I have wondered since how she managed that. "He has decided that it would be better for Russia at this moment for him to step aside from his official duties. He is coming home, and we will be together." Olga understood immediately. I saw it in her face, the knowledge landing behind her eyes and settling there. She said nothing. Tatiana took her mother's hand. Maria's eyes filled with tears, though she pressed them back. And Anastasia, always the one to say the thing the others were thinking. "Are we still Grand Duchesses?" For a moment, the Tsarina's composure wavered. Just a moment, just a small, involuntary softening of the face that was gone before it could fully form. Then she smoothed her daughter's hair with one hand, a gesture so familiar, so purely maternal, that it cut through all the ceremony and history and political consequence and landed exactly where it needed to. "You are still my children," she said. "We are still a family. Everything else we will face together." On March 22nd, the Tsar returned. I saw him come through the palace doors, thinner than he had been, the military uniform that had always fit him so precisely, now seeming to belong to a slightly larger man. There was something changed about his posture, not quite diminished, but reduced, simplified perhaps, as if he had left the Tsar at Pskov and come home as simply Nicholas. But when he embraced his family, when he opened his arms and they came to him, all of them at once, the children pressing against him and the Tsarina holding him with her face against his shoulder, something returned. Not the emperor, but the man, the father, the center of that particular small world. His arms went around each of them in turn. He held Alexei for a long time, his hand on the back of the boy's head, his eyes closed. He did not cry in front of them. He did not cry at all, in any room where I was present. But in his eyes that evening, when he thought no one was watching, there was something that would never leave them again. Life at the Alexander Palace settled into a strange simulacrum of the old order. Meals were taken at the same hours. Lessons continued. Cards were played in the evenings. The Tsar walked in the garden and read in his study and occupied the familiar shapes of his days. but every movement was observed. Representatives of the provisional government came and went. Guards who had served the household for years were replaced by men chosen for different loyalties. Conversations were conducted more carefully. Correspondence was monitored. Visitors, once a constant stream of relatives, ministers, diplomats, petitioners, dwindled to almost nothing. I remained, as did a handful of others, Dr. Botkin, the tutor Gilliard, Anna Demidova, who had served the Tsarina nearly as long as I had. We were the loyal remnant, a circle that shrank a little each week as the pressures of the new world made the old loyalties harder to sustain. The former Tsarina bore confinement with a grace that surprised me. Released from the demands of court life, the receptions, the ceremonies, the constant performance of imperial dignity, she seemed in some ways to soften. She spent more time with the children, reading aloud in the evenings, helping with their lessons. She mended clothes with her own hands. She wrote letters that she knew would likely be read by others before they were delivered, and wrote them anyway, choosing her words with the patience of someone tending something fragile. The Tsar, too, found a kind of peace in the reduction. He chopped wood in the courtyard. This was not metaphor. He actually chopped wood, regular stacks of it, far more than they needed, and gardened in the spring, and read aloud from Russian history in the evenings. The burdens of state had been lifted from him, and what remained underneath them was a man who was, in many ways, simply himself for the first time in his adult life. It was a terrible irony. The circumstances that had destroyed him as a ruler seemed, in some quiet way, to have restored him as a person. But the children paid a cost. Olga, who had turned 21 and had imagined for herself a life opening outward, travel, independence, perhaps the marriage that had been discussed before the war changed everything, watched that future close. She grew quieter as the months passed, spending long hours at the window, reading, writing in her journal in a hand I never read. The sadness that had always been part of her settled more deeply in. Tatiana organized. She always organized. She structured the household's days, managed the small logistics of their confined life, made sure there was something purposeful happening at every hour. It was her way of maintaining dignity, I think, of insisting that a shape remained, even when the world that had given it meaning was gone. Maria and Anastasia, younger, more resilient, more present tense in their natures, coped better on the surface. Their laughter still came, still surprised you with its genuineness, but I noticed them growing watchful, quieter with strangers, more careful about what they said in front of the new guards. And Alexei made friends with a young soldier posted outside his window. I watched them sometimes from a discreet distance, their heads together over some game or conversation, the soldier young enough that the difference in their situations seemed, for the duration of a shared laugh, not to matter. It was one of the small mercies of that period, those unlikely connections. The world had not yet managed to be only cruel. In the summer of 1917, there was serious talk of exile. England had been discussed. King George, the Tsar's cousin, though the resemblance between them had always been almost uncanny, as if they had been cast from the same mold and only history had pressed them into different shapes. The Tsarina spoke of it with something approaching hope in her voice. A dacha somewhere, she imagined, a quiet life, the children growing up in peace. I I watched the hope in her eyes and recognized it as a thing she was consciously maintaining, the way you maintain a fire when you are not sure you have enough wood to last the night. It was not naive hope. She knew what the world was now. But she had children, and children require something to be told about tomorrow. Then came October, and the Bolsheviks swept the provisional government away with the particular efficiency of people who have been planning this for years and are finally executing a plan they know by heart. Lenin arrived at the Finland station. The Winter Palace fell in a single night. The phrase provisional government vanished from the newspapers as if it had never existed, replaced by new phrases, new certainties, new enemies. Guards changed. The men who had watched over the family at Alexander Palace, not friendly exactly, but known quantities, were replaced by others. Different faces, different attitudes, a different atmosphere entirely, one that had moved past suspicion into something colder. The family was forbidden to speak anything but Russian. Their library was searched, their correspondence reviewed and largely returned undelivered. The food became simpler, then simpler still. These were not, I understood, random inconveniences. They were deliberate communications. They were being told, daily, through 100 small degradations, what they now were. The worst were the eyes, the way the new guards looked at them, not at the Tsar or the Tsarina as former rulers who must be watched, but at all of them, the children included, with a flat assessment that made no distinction between crown and braid, between aged 50 and aged 13. They were a category, and the category was the enemy. One night, helping her undress, this simple ritual that had persisted through everything, 2 women in a lamplit room, the familiar gestures of help and trust, she asked me, in a voice very low and without looking up, "Yelena Fyodorovna, do you think I am a bad person?" I went still. In all the years of service, in all the conversations we had managed in the margins of her public life, she had never asked me anything like this. "Your Majesty," I said, "why would you say that?" "Because everyone else does." She finally looked at me, and her eyes were dry, which was somehow worse than tears would have been. "The newspapers say it. The guards think it. I see it in their faces. Even the silence in this house feels like a verdict. I lie awake, and I try to think of what I did that was so terrible, and I can find things, mistakes, misjudgments, failures of understanding, but I cannot find the wickedness they claim. And yet I wonder if I am simply unable to see myself clearly." I knelt beside her chair, something I had never done before, something that collapsed the formal distance between us in a way that felt necessary and right. "You are a mother," I said, "a wife, a woman who spent years visiting hospitals before anyone knew about it, who held the hands of dying soldiers, who prayed over the wounded, who kissed her children goodnight and told them they were loved. That is what I know of you. That is what I have witnessed. Whatever failures of policy or judgment you may have made, and all people in positions of power make them, I have never seen wickedness in you, Not once. Not in 15 years. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched my hand, the back of it very lightly, the way you touch something you want to remember the feeling of. "Thank you," she said. "You have always seen me, not what I represent to people, but what I actually am. That has been a gift, a real one." I did not know how to answer that, so I said nothing, and we sat for a while in the lamplight, two women at the end of something enormous, being ordinary with each other for perhaps the last time. April 1918. The order came. They were to be moved to Ekaterinburg. The official reasoning was security. The White Army was advancing in the Urals, and the family's presence in Petrograd was a strategic liability. Everyone understood that the reasoning was true only in the way that all official reasoning is true, partially, selectively, in service of a conclusion that had already been reached by other means. The night before their departure, the Tsarina called me to her room. She was at her sewing table, working by candlelight, and she asked me to sit beside her. What she was sewing, I did not understand at first. Small objects, flat, into the lining of a corset. "Jewels," she said. "Stones, mostly. Things that can be sewn in, carried without detection. For the children, for whatever comes." I sat beside her and I helped her work without speaking. It was a task that required careful hands and poor light and a great deal of patience, and we performed it together in silence for the better part of an hour. It was not, I understood, primarily a practical act. It was a ritual. A mother preparing what she could prepare, doing what could be done, in a situation where so much could not be controlled. She spoke then of the children, of Olga's burdened strength and Tatiana's steadfastness, and Maria's openness, and Anastasia's refusal to be diminished, and Alexei's quiet, gallant acceptance of a body that had never been kind to him. She spoke of them as they actually were, in the specific detail of someone who has paid close attention for many years. She was composing something, I understood, building something against the possibility that she would not always be there to remember it for them. "They are not symbols," she said at last, the needle still in her hand. "Whatever the world decides to do with what they represent, they are not symbols. They are children. They deserved ordinary things, laughter, friends, futures that were their own to make." I nodded. My throat was too full for words. When the train departed the next morning in the pale April light, it was not the imperial carriage of old, with its painted interiors and monogrammed silver. It was a plain railway car, unremarkable, the curtains drawn across the windows. As it pulled away from the platform, I stood with a small group of remaining servants and watched it go. And in the last moment before the train rounded the curve and disappeared, I saw Anastasia's face at the window. She had pulled the curtain aside just slightly, and she was looking out at the city, at the people on the platform, at the ordinary world she was leaving, with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but something that belonged to 17-year-olds who have not yet fully accepted that the worst things can actually happen to them. I raised my hand. I don't know if she saw it. That was the last time I saw them alive. I did not know it then. I think, in the part of me that already knew things I wasn't ready to acknowledge, I did. I followed them to Ekaterinburg because I could not think of what else to do. Loyalty, when it has been the organizing principle of your life for 15 years, does not simply stop when the circumstances that made it possible are removed. It finds other forms. It becomes witness when it cannot become service. I was not permitted to remain in service. The Bolsheviks claimed the family required fewer attendants, a more modest household commensurate with their new situation. In truth, my loyalty to the Tsarina was itself the disqualification. I was a relic of the old world, and the old world was precisely what they were trying to erase. What they did not understand was that erasing a world does not make its people disappear. It simply makes them quieter. Dr. Botkin, the devoted physician who had served the family for years and who had refused multiple times every offer of a safer alternative, was permitted to stay. Anna Demidova, the Tsarina's maid, the cook, Ivan Kharitonov, and a boy named Leonid Syednev who had served Alexei. A handful of others. The household that had once required dozens to maintain was compressed into a handful of loyal souls who had chosen proximity over safety. The rest of us, those deemed unnecessary or too connected to the old order, or simply inconvenient, were released into the city like birds expelled from a nest, finding our way in a world where our past was now a liability and our skills were only valuable if we could detach them from their origin. I found work at Frau Weber's laundry in a building 3 streets removed from the city center, run by a German woman of late middle age whose bitterness was so evenly distributed across all of existence that it functioned almost like fairness. She asked few questions, paid in bread as much as in money, and worked her staff hard enough that there was little time for the kind of thinking that leads to trouble. The work gave me something more valuable than income. It gave me proximity. Every morning, I walked past the Ipatiev house on my way to work. Every evening, I walked by again. It became my ritual, unhurried, unremarked, a woman moving through a city on an ordinary errand, her eyes naturally falling on a building that happened to be on her route. The house sat on a modest hill at the corner of Voznesensky Prospect and Voznesensky Lane, a former merchant's home that had been commandeered for its current purpose, the way all private things were being commandeered now, by the simple application of necessity. It was a solid, respectable building, 2 stories, white-painted walls, green shutters that had once given it a pleasant domestic character. But now a tall wooden fence had been erected around its perimeter, close enough to the walls that it blocked the view from the street entirely. Barbed wire ran along the top. Armed guards stood at the gate and patrolled the perimeter on a schedule I gradually learned to track. The townspeople had taken to calling it the House of Special Purpose, a phrase that told you everything and nothing, which was, I suppose, precisely the intention. Nobody said what the special purpose was. Nobody asked directly. There was an unspoken agreement in the city that some questions were not currently worth asking, that the cost of curiosity had risen beyond what most people could afford. I lodged above a bakery run by a widow named Katya, a stout, practical woman who had lost her husband to the first year of the war and her eldest son to the second, and who had decided somewhere along the way that sentiment was a luxury and survival was the only legitimate ambition. She was cautious with me at first, as everyone was cautious with newcomers in those days, when a person's past was both their most valuable asset and their most dangerous liability. But I could do things she needed done. I understood fabrics, fine ones, the kind that required particular handling. I understood household management. I was useful, and in the world that was assembling itself out of the rubble of the old one, usefulness was the most legible form of worth. "You have the bearing of someone who served someone important," she said to me one evening over cabbage soup in her cramped kitchen. "I served in a large household," I said. She studied me for a moment. "In Petrograd?" "Yes." She nodded slowly and asked nothing else. The soup was thin but hot. We ate in the peaceful silence of people who understand each other's need not to be understood too thoroughly. At the laundry, I worked long hours over basins of steaming water, my hands raw by mid-morning from the lye and the heat and the weight of wet fabric. We cleaned the uniforms of local Bolshevik officials, the tablecloths of the new committee headquarters, the more delicate items of the wives of party men who were discovering that power brought with it certain domestic expectations. It was a strange occupation, handling the intimate fabric of a world I did not recognize, returning it pressed and clean and ready for its purposes. We also, occasionally, cleaned items brought from the Ipatiev house. Not often, and never anything I recognized. But once, in the early weeks of June, a bundle arrived that included a small embroidered handkerchief, white cotton, very fine, with a simple monogram in pale blue thread in the corner. The letter A in a hand I knew. I held it for a moment over the basin, then set it apart from the rest and cleaned it with particular care, and pressed it and returned it with everything else in the bundle. I said nothing to anyone. What was there to say? It was enough in that moment to know they were still there, still using handkerchiefs, still requiring the small, practical services of ordinary life, still, in some minimal sense, present. The city itself was in a state of suspended attention. Ekaterinburg was a working city, a mining and manufacturing city, not a capital or a court. It had its own rhythms, its own politics, its own particular character, which was practical and somewhat rough-edged and not naturally deferential. Many of its residents had supported the revolution. Many others had simply adapted to it, as practical people adapt to changed conditions. A smaller number harbored the old loyalties quietly, in the privacy of their own thoughts, which was the only place it was safe to harbor them. The White Army was advancing from the east. This was the dominant fact of the summer of 1918 in Ekaterinburg. The approach of the opposing force, Kolchak's armies moving steadily closer, the possibility of the city changing hands, of the war arriving here, of everything that had been settled becoming unsettled again. The Bolshevik officials moved with increasing urgency. Meetings multiplied, dispatches went out daily, men arrived from Moscow or from Ekaterinburg's own revolutionary committee with the slightly too composed expressions of people executing decisions that have already been made somewhere above them. I learned the rhythms of the house by watching. The red-haired guard who walked his patrol with a slight slouch, who sometimes paused in the garden on warm evenings and tilted his head back toward the sky, as if reminding himself that the sky was still there. The older guard, limping slightly from what looked like an old wound, who moved through his duties with the air of a man who has been doing difficult things for a long time and has made his peace with the difficulty. A third, dark-haired, who gave orders in short bursts and never looked uncertain about anything. I learned also to read the house itself, the angles at which certain curtains hung, whether a particular upstairs window was cracked open or sealed, whether the garden showed signs of recent use. These were not useful pieces of information in any practical sense. I could do nothing with them, act on nothing, change nothing. But observing them was a form of attendance, of continued service in the only way still available to me. Stories circulated through the city like water finding its level. A delivery driver who had brought supplies to the house told me, over tea at Katya's kitchen table, that the Tsar had been seen in the courtyard, thinner, certainly, but standing straight, chopping wood with the same methodical calm he had apparently brought to everything. "He looked like a decent man," the driver said, with a slight surprise in his voice, as if decency in that particular address was not what he had expected to find. A seamstress who had some connection to a woman whose husband worked in a minor administrative capacity told me the girls were quiet, that they had been polite to everyone, that the youngest still sometimes tried to make conversation through windows with people passing on the street, but that the others had learned to discourage this. They had learned, in other words, to be careful, to take up less space, to make themselves less visible even when they were, by definition, the most watched people in the city. Each account was a thread. I wound them together and held on. Spring turned to summer. The heat arrived in June, heavy and close. The Ipatiev house shimmered slightly in the afternoons, its white walls bleached further by the sun, its shutters closed against the heat and against visibility in equal measure. The guards sweated in their wool coats and grew shorter in temper. The fence had been reinforced twice, new planks added to close gaps that had allowed occasional glimpses into the yard. Then came a night in the second week of June when I saw strangers entering the house. Men I had not seen before, wearing the leather coats that had come to signify a particular kind of official authority in this new world. Not soldiers, not local administrators. Men whose bearing communicated that they had come from elsewhere and reported to someone above the local structure. They entered in the evening and did not emerge until well past midnight. I watched from my window, unable to sleep, watching the house as I had watched it every night since arriving in the city. When they finally left, they left in silence, their faces giving nothing away. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the house after that night. I felt it rather than saw it, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before the weather shifts. The guards moved differently the next morning, more precisely, with the particular quality of attention that people exhibit when they have received orders that clarify their purpose. At the laundry, I made small errors, burned a collar on the pressing iron, allowed a delicate lace to catch and tear. Frau Weber noticed. "You're somewhere else entirely today," she said, not unkindly. "I'm sorry. There's talk in the city. Kolchak's men are 3 days away, some people say." She set down the item she had been examining. "The committee is preparing to leave. My neighbor says her husband saw crates being loaded at the railway station last night." I received this and said nothing. "Whatever they're going to do with the people in that house," Frau Weber said very quietly, and then she stopped. She shook her head just slightly. "Never mind. Fold that one again. The corners aren't right." We returned to work. But the sentence she had not finished sat between us for the rest of the day, taking up space. That evening, more vehicles arrived at the Ipatiev house. A truck, heavy laden, its cargo covered. It was unloaded by men who moved quickly and spoke in low voices and did not look up when I passed on the far side of the street. That night, I wrote a letter to my sister in Moscow. I described Ekaterinburg as I had come to know it: the wide streets, the summer heat, the particular light in the late evenings when the sun stayed far too long. I described the bakery and Katya's soup and the laundry and Frau Weber's exacting standards. I wrote everything except the thing I was actually writing about. I never sent the letter. There was no one I trusted with it. But writing it helped. It was a way of insisting that the world still existed, that ordinary description still meant something, that the language of the ordinary had not been entirely consumed by events. The house stood silent in the long summer evening, lamps extinguished early, curtains drawn. Inside, 7 people moved through whatever small motions their confinement permitted: eating, praying, reading, playing cards by candlelight, doing the practical work of being alive in a place that was running out of reasons to keep them that way. And I sat at my window and watched the dark outline of the fence against the darkening sky, and I held on to what I knew of them, and I prepared myself in the way that you prepare yourself for things you cannot stop, by simply deciding to remain present when they happened. That was all I could do. It had to be enough. It would have to be. July 16th, 1918, began like any other summer day in Ekaterinburg, and yet it did not begin like any other day at all. There was something in the quality of the morning light that was different, though I could not have told you precisely how. I have thought about this many times since, wondering if what I remember is what I actually perceived or what I have since imposed upon the memory, the mind's way of providing the warning that the events themselves did not. But I think it was real. The morning was unnaturally still. Even the birds seemed reluctant. The street outside my window, which usually began its noise at first light, remained quiet longer than usual. The air had the close, expectant quality that sometimes precedes a storm, except that the sky was cloudless. I dressed and walked to the laundry. I passed the Ipatiev house as I did every morning. The guards were in their usual positions, but I noticed, without being able to articulate what I noticed, that they were standing slightly differently, more precisely, with the particular stillness of people who are waiting for a specific thing rather than simply performing a general function. At the laundry, my hands would not do what I asked of them. I scalded myself twice on the press, which I had not done in months. I let a linen stay in the water past its time, and it took a mark it shouldn't have. Frau Weber watched me from across the room. "You're like a cat before a thunderstorm," she said. "I know, I'm sorry." I wrung out the linen and hung it. Something feels wrong today. I can't name it. The whole city feels like it's holding its breath. She looked at me steadily for a moment. The Whites are within 2 days, maybe less. People are saying Kolchak's advance units could reach the city by Thursday at the outside. She smoothed a tablecloth with her palms. Whatever decisions need to be made about the people in that house, They don't have much longer to make them. She said it plainly, without emotion, as a statement of practical arithmetic. But it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water, the rings spreading outward through the rest of the day. I went about the day's work. I folded and pressed and sorted and delivered. I spoke to the women I worked alongside about ordinary things, a shortage of a particular soap, a wedding in the next street over, the question of whether the summer heat would break before August. I said nothing of what I felt, which was a kind of dread so quiet and so total it was almost like peace. At midday, on my way to deliver a package of cleaned items to a party official's wife 3 streets away, I passed the Ipatyev house and stopped, very briefly, as if adjusting something in my bundle. The fence was unchanged. The shutters were closed. A guard stood at the gate, not the red-haired one, but the dark-haired one, the one who never looked uncertain. He looked at me for a moment with flat, disinterested eyes, and then looked away. Nothing visible had changed, and yet something had. On my way back, I saw a black automobile parked at the side gate, not the supply entrance, but a different one, smaller, usually unused. It was a large, curtain-lined vehicle, and 2 men in leather coats stood beside it, smoking in silence. When I came within earshot, their conversation ceased. One of them turned to watch me pass with the patient, evaluating look of someone who has learned to assess everything that moves in his vicinity. I kept walking. I did not look back. My heart was doing something irregular in my chest. That evening at the bakery, Katya called out as I came up the stairs. "Come, have some tea. You look pale." I sat at her kitchen table and wrapped my hands around the cup and let the warmth work its way into me. The kitchen smelled of yeast and caraway, of the bread that was the center of her world and mine during these months, the smell of the most basic form of sustenance. "My nephew works at the telegraph office," she said, sitting across from me, her voice pitched low, though we were alone. "He said today has been unusual. Messages going in and out all day. From Moscow, from the local committee, back and forth. Coded ones mostly. He said he's never seen so much traffic in a single day, not even during the provisional government business." I held my cup. "He thinks something is being authorized," she said, "or has already been." We sat with that for a moment. The kettle on the stove made small, settling noises. "Will they move them?" I asked. It was the question that had seemed most reasonable for most of the previous weeks, that the family would be relocated again, taken further east or west, moved out of reach of the advancing White Army. Katya looked at her hands. "I don't think so," she said quietly. "Not anymore. There isn't time to move them safely, and I think moving them safely was never really the point." I excused myself soon after. I told her I needed to rest. It was a lie, and she knew it, and she let me tell it, which was a kindness. I did not rest. I sat at my window in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, and I watched the Ipatyev house across the distance of rooftops and fence lines and the deepening summer dusk. Ekaterinburg had a particular quality at this hour, the sky holding its light longer than seemed reasonable, the blue deepening slowly toward purple toward the east while the west still glowed. It was a beautiful evening. I noted this with a strange precision. Beautiful evenings go on happening, I thought, regardless of what happens underneath them. At around 10 o'clock, I saw the black automobile return. Another vehicle followed it, a truck, dark, curtainless. Men entered the house through the side gate. 7, 8, I lost count. They did not emerge. The street was empty. The city was quiet, with the particular quiet of a warm summer night when sensible people are inside and sensible people are pretending they cannot see or hear anything that might complicate their safety. I heard, very faintly, a truck engine start. It idled for some time, 10 minutes perhaps, perhaps longer. The sound filled the spaces between the sounds of the night, a low mechanical rumble that seemed to come from inside the fence, from behind those high wooden planks. Then it stopped. Then another started. Then that too stopped. Machinery, I thought, being warmed, being readied. I lay down on my bed, still dressed, because lying down seemed like what a person did at this hour. My mind moved through its memories the way a hand moves through water, finding each one by feel, holding it briefly, releasing it. The Tsarina at her window, watching the snow. The children singing around the piano. The Tsar in the garden with Alexei, the boy's hand in his father's hand, the two of them moving slowly in the late light of a Petersburg summer evening that was nothing like this summer evening, but felt, from this distance, like the same golden world. I thought, they are in that house, right now, this minute. They have eaten supper, perhaps. Perhaps they have read aloud, or played cards, or simply sat together in the way families sit when there is nothing to do and everything to fear. Perhaps Anastasia has made them laugh. Perhaps Alexei is sleeping. Perhaps the Tsarina is writing in her diary by candlelight, in the careful, precise hand I know so well, recording the day's small events for the historical record she still, even now, believed would eventually matter to someone. I thought, they are there, and I am here, and the distance between us is only a few hundred yards, and there is nothing I can do to close it. Then, sometime past 1 in the morning, I could not be certain of the hour. My clock ran slow and I had lost track. The sound came. Gunfire. Not a single shot, not the measured cadence of something official or ceremonial. A burst, rapid, sustained, then pausing, then erupting again, then more shots scattered across an interval, some of them different in pitch and quality, as if multiple weapons were being discharged in a space that was too small for them. It was not a long sound, perhaps a minute, perhaps less, but it went on long enough that there could be no mistaking what it was or what it meant. Then silence. A silence so absolute, so complete, so unlike any silence I had experienced before, that I understood it as a different category of silence entirely. Not the silence of sleep or stillness or the spaces between ordinary sounds, but the silence that exists on the other side of something that cannot be undone. I sat perfectly still. Every part of me had gone rigid. The room was dark. Outside, the sky was beginning to show the first, faint distinction between night and not quite night that precedes dawn in summer. I did not move. I did not think, in the ordinary sense of thinking. Something had happened to thought. It had become very simple, very elemental. I was present. I was a witness. That was all I was in that moment, and it felt both terrible and necessary. Faintly, after some time, I could not say how long, I heard engines. Trucks starting in sequence, driving. The sound diminishing as the vehicles moved away from the house, down toward the city's edge, toward the forests that lay to the north and east, toward the places outside the city where the ground was soft enough to receive things that needed to be hidden. The sound faded. The silence returned. I stayed at the window until the sky had lightened enough that the shape of the Ipatyev house was visible again, its familiar silhouette unchanged, the fence around it unchanged, the shutters closed, the gate shut. Everything looked exactly as it had before. That was, perhaps, the thing I have never fully recovered from, that it looked exactly the same. Katya knocked at my door when the morning was fully arrived. One look at my face, and she did not ask any question. "You heard it," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." So did I. She came in and sat on the edge of the one chair and looked at her hands in her lap. The Savichevs next door heard it. Old Milyukov on the first floor. We all heard it. She looked up. "No one will say a word." "No," I agreed. "No one will say a word." She got up after a moment and left. I heard her moving around her kitchen below, the familiar sounds of her mourning, water and fire and the thump of bread dough. She was making order from the ingredients she had. It was what she knew how to do. It was what any of us knew how to do. I went to the laundry. I worked all day without speaking except when spoken to. At midday, the Bolshevik newspaper printed a brief notice. By order of the Ural Soviet, the former Tsar Nicholas Romanov had been executed in the interest of the revolution. The family, the notice said, had been moved to a place of safety. No one at the laundry believed the second part of that sentence. No one said so. The newspaper was set aside. Work continued. I folded linens for the rest of the afternoon with absolute precision, each corner exactly right, each crease deliberate and straight. It was the only thing I could make correct in that particular world, on that particular day. So I made it correct. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors left in the rain, each one bleeding into the next, the edges dissolving, the colors running. I moved through them as I had learned to move through the worst periods of my life, by performing the gestures of ordinary existence with sufficient precision that the ordinary existence eventually, partially, resumed. You fold the linen, you eat the soup, you nod at the woman at the pump, you carry the basket, you keep moving. The official story shifted with the weather. First, they reported only the Tsar's execution. The family had been safely relocated, the announcement said. The children were unharmed. Then the Tsarina's death was acknowledged too, but still the children were rumored to be alive in some unspecified location, under some unspecified protection. Then the White Army reached Ekaterinburg and published their own account, and the accounts did not agree, and for some months the fate of the children existed in a kind of public uncertainty that I think was not entirely accidental. It was easier to manage a myth with ambiguous borders. I watched people navigate this uncertainty according to their needs. Revolutionaries spoke of necessary justice, of the danger of a symbol the old regime might rally around, of the inexorable logic of historical change. Monarchists wept and lit candles and spoke of martyrdom. Most ordinary people, Katja, Frau Weber, the women at the laundry, the men at the market, said as little as possible and went about their lives in the cautious way of people who understand that the political weather can shift without warning, and that having said the wrong thing on the wrong day is a liability that can outlast the day itself. The Romanovs were being rewritten in real time. Their deaths, their murders, though that word was not used in print, were becoming material for competing mythologies before their bodies were cold. This is what happens to history, I thought. The people disappear and the meanings multiply. For me, they had never been meanings. They had been faces. About 3 weeks after the night of the 16th, I saw the red-haired guard again. I had been walking back from the market in the late afternoon, my basket on my arm, and I looked through the window of a small tavern on Uspenskaya Street and saw him there, alone at a table in the corner, with a glass in front of him that appeared to have been refilled several times. He was not a large man, and he looked smaller than I remembered him from my daily observations outside the Ipatyev house. Smaller and younger and less certain. I hesitated outside on the pavement for a long moment, conducting an argument with myself about whether entering was wise. The argument concluded the way such arguments usually conclude, when the outcome is already determined by something older than reason. I went in. I sat at the table across from him. He looked up. "I've seen you," he said. His voice was thick, but his eyes were clear in the way that eyes sometimes are when drink has not blurred them, but simply stripped away whatever was keeping them politely vague. Walking past, every day, sometimes twice a day. You knew them. It was not a question. I did not treat it as one. Yes. He looked back at his glass. He was perhaps 22 years old. He had a young man's hands and an old man's expression, and the combination was painful to look at. "They were decent," he said at last. "Polite to everyone, even after everything. The boy used to ask after my health. I had a cough earlier in the summer when I first came to that posting. He noticed. He would ask when he saw me whether it was better, as if it mattered to him, as if he genuinely—" He stopped. I waited. "He was a sick boy who was kind to a guard," the young man said. "That's what he was. That's the whole of it." "Yes," I said. "They told us it was justice." He turned the glass between his palms. "For the people, for the revolution, for all the things the old regime did, and it did things. I know it did things. I know the history." He looked up at me. "But justice doesn't sound like that. It doesn't sound like what I heard that night." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine for a moment. He looked at it as if he wasn't quite sure what to do with the gesture, this small, ordinary kindness in a world that had recently shown him its other face. "You didn't pull the trigger," I said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "But I was there. Before, during, after. I heard it, and I stayed at my post, and I went back to the barracks, and I ate breakfast the next morning." His voice flattened. "That's not innocence. That's just distance. And distance doesn't wash off. I've tried. It doesn't." He left the tavern without looking at me again. I sat there for some time after, thinking about the varieties of complicity, about the difference between doing and allowing, about whether that distinction means anything in the end when you measure it against what was done. I thought about how many people across the city had heard the shots that night, how many had lain in their beds and understood and said nothing, and risen in the morning and resumed their lives. The arithmetic of shared silence. We had all been bystanders in the end. Those of us who were not inside that house had stood outside it, in one sense or another, and watched the fence, and known, and been unable or unwilling to do anything more than know. This was not the same as pulling the trigger, but it was not innocence either. I sat with that for a long time. I have sat with it, in one form or another, ever since. The White Army entered Ekaterinburg on July 25th, 9 days after the executions, and briefly the city became a different place, or tried to. Photographs of the Romanovs appeared in windows that had held nothing before. Old women crossed themselves openly in the streets. A service was held at the cathedral that went on for hours and drew a crowd that blocked the surrounding streets. I attended. I stood at the back, near the doors, in case I needed to leave quickly. Old habits. The priest spoke of martyrdom, of innocent blood, of souls received into heaven with the particular welcome reserved for those who died unjustly. The congregation wept without restraint. I found, to my slight surprise, that I could not. My grief was real. It was as real as anything I had ever felt, but it was too specific, too personal, too full of particular faces and voices and gestures to find relief in the collective form of mourning. I had not loved an idea of them. I had loved them. After the service, I walked to the Ipatiev house, which stood empty now, its purpose discharged. The fence was partly dismantled. The gate was open. Someone had placed a small bunch of wildflowers against the front door. Yellow ones. I don't know their name, the kind that grow in fields. They were already wilting in the July heat. I stood on the pavement outside for a while. An old woman came past with a small dog and slowed when she saw me. "You knew them," she said. People kept saying this to me as if it were written on my face. "Yes," I said. "I saw them once, years ago, before the war, at some ceremony." She looked so sad even then, as if she already knew how it would end. She looked at the house. "Do you think they understood at the end?" I considered the question carefully. "I think they hoped," I said at last. "I think they maintained hope longer than most people would have, because they had each other, and because hope was something they could give to their children, and that mattered to them. I think at the very end they knew, but I believe that they were not alone, and that they were together, and that being together was a form of comfort that nothing could take from them." The old woman nodded and moved on with her small dog. I stood a moment more, then turned away from the house for the last time. A month later, I left Ekaterinburg. I packed my single suitcase with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who has learned that possessions are a form of risk. I said goodbye to Katya, who pressed a wrapped portion of bread into my hands without being asked, and said nothing more than, "Travel safely," because she was a woman who understood that some farewells don't require elaboration. I said goodbye to Frau Weber, who shook my hand with the firm grip of a woman who respects competence, and said, "You are a good worker. Wherever you land, you won't starve." It was not warmth, exactly, but it was genuine, and in that world, genuine was worth a great deal. I walked one last time past the Ipatyev house on my way to the station. It was a gray October morning, the kind of morning that smells of coming winter, of iron and cold earth, and the particular damp of fallen leaves. The house stood empty. The fence was down now completely. The shutters were open. Whatever had happened inside it was already beginning the process of becoming history, becoming something that could be written about and argued over and reinterpreted in the light of subsequent events, rather than something that had happened to specific people in a specific room on a specific night. I stopped in front of it for 1 minute. Exactly 1 minute, I counted. I looked at the building with the deliberate attention of someone committing something to memory for permanent keeping. The placement of the windows, the color of the stone, the way the morning light fell across the upper story, the absence of the family that had been held there, which was present in the building like a held breath. Then I walked to the station, and I boarded the train, and I left. The Romanovs were gone, but I carried them with me in the only way that remained possible. Years have passed since that night in July 1918. Many years, more than I care to count, and I have always been someone who counted carefully. I am an old woman now. My hands are stiff in the mornings, slow to open, reluctant to grip. My eyes require glasses I did not need at 40. My back has opinions about the weather, which is not a quality I would have chosen for it, but which I have come to regard as a kind of forecasting service. I live quietly in a town whose name I will not write here, far from Ekaterinburg, far from the cities and the palaces and the railway stations where the great events of my life occurred. There is very little in this room: a bed, a chair, a table. The wooden icon that has followed me across the country and through multiple decades, its gilt worn smooth by the touch of my thumb in all the years of early mornings and late nights. A few books, history books mostly, the kind that describe the events I witnessed from a distance that makes them almost unrecognizable. A letter from my sister from years ago, now softened at the folds. And memory. Memory that does not require objects. Memory that is, at this point in my life, more vivid than the room it inhabits. The faces and voices and particular gestures of people who have been absent from the world for decades, preserved inside me with a fidelity that seems to increase rather than diminish with time, as if the mind knows it is the last custodian and is taking the responsibility seriously. There are nights I wish I could forget. I will be honest about that. The sound that came through the summer night, the silence that followed it, the red-haired guard's face in the tavern, these things come back with a precision that serves no comfort. I envy sometimes the people who can set things down, who can turn away from what they have witnessed and live in the present with their full attention. But forgetting would be a betrayal. I understood this in Ekaterinburg, and I understand it still. I was placed where I was placed and saw what I saw, and the least I owe to that placement is to carry it faithfully. This is not heroism. It is simply the minimum obligation of a witness. So I remember. I think often about how history turns, how the enormous becomes official, and the official becomes symbol, and the symbol gradually empties of its original content. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of empire, ended in a basement room in a merchant's house in a provincial city in the early hours of a summer morning, without ceremony or record, by men who have been described in subsequent histories in ways that have changed considerably depending on who was writing and when. The palaces where I served are museums now, I am told. The rooms where I spent my days are open to the public, furnished as they were, labeled with small placards that describe the historical significance of each object. The 47 buttons of the morning gown, if the gown still exists, are an artifact. The embroidery frames, the books, the children's schoolroom, all of it preserved, labeled, maintained, as evidence of what was there, of what was lost, of what history decided to end. I understand the museums. I understand the need to preserve the physical evidence of the past, to give people a place to stand inside history and feel its dimensions. But the physical evidence is the least of what there is to remember. What the museums cannot hold is Alexei noticing a young guard's cough, Anastasia making the servants laugh at a theatrical production of her own devising, Maria's natural, uncalculated warmth toward everyone she met, Tatiana pressing her mother's hand in silence at the moment when silence was the only kindness available, Olga at the window, watching the world that was closing around her with steady, clear-eyed attention, determined not to look away. The Tsarina asking me in her study, with one lamp and long shadows, whether I thought the people hated her. The Tsar's arms around his children when he came home, reduced in everything except the love that had always been the most real thing about him. History does not care for such details. History has an appetite for the categorical, for causes and effects and consequences and the clean lines of retrospective logic. It prefers figures to people. But people are not figures. Sometimes I am asked, carefully, in the particular tone of a question that does not fully trust its own right to be asked, whether I think it was justified, whether the executions were necessary, whether the revolution's logic required what happened in that basement room. I have learned to answer carefully, because carefulness is still a form of survival, even now. I describe the historical arguments. I acknowledge the perspective of those who believed that a surviving Romanov line was a genuine political danger in a civil war already consuming hundreds of thousands of lives. I note the documented atrocities of the old regime, the structural violences of the imperial system, the legitimate grievances that fueled the revolution. I am fair. I try to be fair. And then, privately, I hold what I hold, which is this, that Alexei was 13 years old and had done nothing to anyone, and he was killed. That Anastasia was 17 and had spent her adolescence under house arrest, and she was killed. That Olga had passed her entire adult life in a gilded cage, and when the cage became a prison, she tried to make herself useful and kind within it, and she was killed. That none of them chose their birth, any more than the guard who heard the shots chose his, or I chose to fasten 47 buttons on mornings that would become, in retrospect, the closest thing to safety any of us had ever known. I cannot make that into justice. I have tried over the years from many different angles, and I cannot. Other people can. Other people have reasons and frameworks I lack. But when I am alone in this room, with the icon and the stiff hands and the memory that will not diminish, I cannot. I do not share this aloud. The world I live in has its own opinions about what I should think, and expressing the wrong ones has consequences that I am, at my age, too tired to absorb. I have survived by knowing which thoughts to keep inside. It is an old skill, and I have never stopped needing it. The young people I encounter, the younger generation, those who were born after all of this, who learned the revolution as history rather than as weather, they know what they are supposed to think. They have the slogans and the frameworks and the certainties that school and propaganda and the simple fact of having grown up in the world that replaced the one I served have provided. Some of them are thoughtful, some merely certain, most some mixture of both, as young people generally are. I do not argue with them. I am too old for argument, and besides, argument is not the point. What I can offer is not argument, but witness, the particular knowledge of someone who was there, who fastened the buttons and read aloud the novels, and sat in the lamplit rooms and heard the shots through the summer night. That knowledge is not an argument for anything. It is simply what happened, held by the only person in this particular room who holds it. I think sometimes about whether it matters, whether my carrying of these memories makes any difference in the world, whether the fidelity of my witness changes anything. I have concluded over the years that it probably does not change anything in any large sense. History will continue to turn. The categories will continue to prevail over the individuals. The symbol will continue to obscure the person. But it matters to me. It is the organizing fact of my inner life, this commitment to remembering them as they actually were. It is the last form my loyalty can take. And I have never, in all the years of compromises and silences and careful answers, been able to renounce it. I dream about them still. In my dreams, the palace stands in its full grandeur, the rooms lit and warm, the corridors busy with the purposeful traffic of an institution that believes in its own permanence. The Tsarina is at her mirror, and I am fastening buttons, and she is looking through the glass at something beyond it with her characteristic expression of focused distance. The children are in the schoolroom, their heads bent over their books, Anastasia's foot tapping under the table with suppressed energy. The Tsar is in the garden with Alexei, moving slowly in the long evening light, the boy's hand in his. In my dreams, the revolution does not come. The war ends differently. The world makes some other choice at some junction I cannot locate, and the family grows old together. The children become adults. The adults become elders. The generations accumulate in the ordinary way of things. In my dreams, I grow old in service, and Anastasia becomes a grandmother, and Alexei outgrows his illness or learns to live with it, and the 47 buttons are eventually fastened by different hands as mine grow too stiff for the task, and everything continues. Then I wake, and I remember what I know, which is that the war did not end differently, and the world did not make another choice, and the children did not become adults, and the mornings with the buttons ended in a railway car in April 1918 on the way to a city where everything else would end. I lie in the dark for a moment after waking. The icon is just visible, its gold worn to a suggestion. The town outside is quiet. Then I get up, and I wash my face, and I sit with my tea, and I begin the day's work of continuing to be present in the only world there is. What I want to say, what I have wanted to say for years to anyone who might listen, is only this. They were not symbols. The Romanov dynasty was a political structure, a historical phenomenon, a system with documented cruelties and documented failures, subject to legitimate analysis and legitimate criticism and the full weight of historical judgment. All of that is true, and none of it is what I mean. What I mean is this. There was a woman who was afraid of crowds and who nonetheless made herself walk into hospitals full of wounded men because she believed it was her responsibility. There was a man who wept over maps of battlefields where his soldiers were dying and who read fairy tales to his son by candlelight because the boy needed to hear his voice. There was a girl who laughed so naturally, so completely, so without reservation, that anyone within earshot had no choice but to respond. There was a boy who noticed that a young guard had a cough and asked after it, because he was 13 years old and kind, and because kindness was his nature, and no amount of illness or captivity or the knowledge of what was coming had been able to extinguish it. These things happened. I was there. I am the proof that they happened. When I am gone, when this body finally follows all the others into the silence, there will be one fewer person who holds this particular knowledge from the inside. The books will still exist. The records will still exist. The history will continue to be written and revised and argued over. But the specific texture of those mornings, the weight of those buttons in my hands, the sound of those voices in those specific rooms, that will go with me. I have made my peace with this. Memory was never going to outlast the world. But it can outlast a life if it is held faithfully enough, and then, at the end, let go. So let me hold it a little longer. The Tsarina at her mirror, the children around the piano, the Tsar in the garden holding his son's hand, Anastasia's face at the window of the departing train, looking back at a world she was leaving, looking for someone who might save them. I raised my hand. I hope she saw it. I hope, in whatever form hope takes when everything else is gone, that she knew she was seen. That they all knew. That through all of it, the palaces and the prisons and the final darkness, there was someone outside the fence who remembered them as they actually were, and kept that remembering, and refused to let it become anything other than what it was. a family. Imperfect and human and loved. It was enough to have loved them. It has to be enough. It is enough.